be funny at a cocktail party while listening to a good goddamn joke. Or when the crazy say he hates us and they get so red in the head you think they're about to choke.
Welcome back, Doug Pagitt Radio on AM 950, DougPagittRadio.com, in a conversation with John Newman. John's the author of a book, Quest for the Kingdom, The Secret Teachings of Jesus in Light of Yogic Mysticism. He's making a provocative and fresh contribution to the conversation about the teachings of Jesus, suggesting that the teachings of Jesus could be seen through the lens of how we would understand yogic teachers. And yoga going back previous to even Hinduism, that there being an expression of spirituality that maybe Jesus was even tapping into. And before the break, we were talking about how in the Gospel of Thomas, a recently discovered gospel, that you see the flares of this kind of language in ways that are more dramatic than you see them in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that causes quite a bit of struggle for people, because for the last 1,700 years, the canonization process has lended itself toward giving special credence to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so most people's Bibles include those Gospels. And then in 1945, with the discovery of a number of ancient texts, was the introduction of the Gospel of Thomas and some others. And so, John, I was asking you, with the Gospel of Thomas, what do you do with this argument that people would say, no, hang on a minute, Gospel of Thomas is not early material, it's actually later material, and it's been influenced by Greek Gnosticism and separation of body and spirit and all?
Okay, those are 2 points. I'll deal with them. I'll try to deal with them succinctly and briefly.
Great.
In terms of the date of composition, you have, and this is really a good part of the story, you have a lot of the parables of Jesus that appear in the Synoptic Gospels. That would be Mark, Matthew, and Luke. There aren't any in John. And this gives us a chance to take a look at the material in Thomas, stylistically, linguistically, in terms of the Jesus voice print. Does it have paradox? Does it do the things? Does it have the rhetorical strategies and styles of Jesus? And compare them with Mark, Luke, Matthew, and Luke. And to make a long story short, the hundreds of scholars that have been looking at this now for the last 30 years have come to the conclusion that of the, say, 9 or 10 parables that unquestionably go back to Jesus, 6 of them in Thomas are earlier and more authentic. And there's a lot more material like that in the aphorisms and other sayings of his, sayings that look less changed, less added to, they're more primitive and more authentic. So on that ground alone, we have come to the conclusion, I say we in the broader sense, in the North America, Canada, the United States, are coming to look at Thomas as composed originally in the mid-40s to late 40s, even if there were things added later. And with respect to Greek Gnosticism, this was an argument that was very popular back in the 70s and 80s when this whole thing started.
Right.
And
That's
we
how
are
I was
moving
introduced to
away
the
from
Gospel
that
of
now.
Thomas, was that it's basically Greek Gnosticism.
Exactly. And the Gnostics thought themselves perfect, just needed a Redeemer to be reawakened. And the teachings of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas are anything but that. It's a long, hard road. And it was very difficult for these early Christian communities to actually recruit and retain people with that kind of message. So you had a tendency in the Synoptics, and it occurred a little bit in Thomas too, as time went on, to sort of trying to dilute that message so that they could keep members. But it is not Gnosticism. In fact, it's pretty much the opposite of Gnosticism.
Oh, that's interesting, because I even had a sense in looking at the material from your book that maybe it had a bit of that Gnostic sense, but you would say no, it's really something other than that. It's not advocating a body-spirit divide.
You can find a few Gnostic edits in there. They're there, but there are more of the edits, more of the stuff that's not authentic is basically Jewish esotericism, and it's Encretism, and the Encretites were vegetarian celibates in Edessa, Syria, and in Alexandria, where the gospel had traveled. So it really has very little to do with Gnosticism, a lot more to do with some of the other Christian communities that were in development in the late 1st century and early 2nd century.
Oh, great. Well, then, for those who are listening and don't know what Gnosticism is, it's a theological position that says that knowledge is what frees us from the confines of our bodies. So you can think about Gnosticism like knowledge, that there are people who were advocating a secret knowledge, and if you acquired that secret knowledge through a series of practices and ceremonies, then you would reach a kind of spiritual enlightenment. Now you not only make an argument about Jesus' teachings being connected to this early yogic tradition, but then you also argue in the book that it's connected to a way in which Freud saw healing
Yes.
So you're doing an interesting thing in the book. We're taking, 300 to 3000 BC arguments and also mid-20th century psychological arguments. Talk a little bit about why you see Jesus's healings through the lens of what Freud is trying to do in modern psychology.
I think, from my perspective, it was one of the most fascinating finds of my work for the last 5 years. First of all, modern psychiatrists in the 20th century, Freud, just one of them, have long understood that what the yogis are doing is very similar to the psychotic breakups they've been observing in their patients.
Oh, interesting.
We go deep into the unconscious mind. That's what we do. The difference is that in that space, in those waters, the psychotic is drowning, the yogi is swimming. So we train ourselves to do that. Now,
can I interrupt you to say that again? You said that in those deep waters you go to, when a psychotic is drowning but a yogi is swimming.
Absolutely.
So you go to the same place, but it's how you experience that sort of depth of psychological analysis?
The psychotic will bring the baggage in there with them. The yogi will leave it behind.
Wow, interesting.
Okay? Mm-hmm. And so we could talk forever about that, but as far as Jesus, he used those techniques. He would tell you a story. He would put information gaps in it. He would use word repetition like Freud did. It was very hypnotic, but he was the master of metaphor. All the techniques he used were designed to control the trajectory of discourse in the minds of his hearers and his patients, just like a modern psychodynamic interventionist would do.
Wow. Now, there are people who would say, look, you're talking about early, 2,000 year ago development of a teaching and writing style. Is it really possible for it to have been as sophisticated, in year 20 as we would now have in the 20th century?
Actually, Jesus was a little better at it than Freud was. Freud recognized that the ego, which is the problem, that they called it a demon back then. We called it a dysfunctional or out of control ego.
Yeah.
Freud understood and wrote about that it too had a blind spot. It too had a little part of it that was unconscious. Mm-hmm. And Jesus knew about that, and he used it and broadened it to actually turn the lights out in that side of consciousness. He said, don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing. Your left hand is the ego, the right hand is your spirit. And the struggle was for the intellect. And so the objective was to turn off the lights in the house of the ego and turn them on in the house of the spirit.
Mm-hmm. Now, when most people go to a yoga class, and they go to, the yoga center nearby and they do their stretching and all, and most people in their yoga experiences aren't engaging in it to this degree. Would you grant that? Like what you're talking about, what's going on is a way of really diving into your own sense of emotional well-being. That's not what most people are up to, though, when they're doing an exercise program, are they?
Yeah, yoga has 8 limbs to it.
Uh-huh.
The third limb is poses. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which is really the most fundamental writings about yoga, have 198 things. Only 3 of them even mention poses. Okay? So the poses are just preparation for the mental side of the practice. And those yogis who have stayed with it for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years quickly come to understand that the mental side of the practice is far more powerful and rewarding than the physical side. Most people go to it for flexibility and they want to look good and that sort of thing. But surprise, it's been around here for 5,000 or 6,000 years because it does a lot more than that.
Interesting. That's John Newman. His book is Quest for the Kingdom, The Secret Teachings of Jesus in the Light of Yogic Mysticism. Hey, John, I appreciate your book so much. Thanks for doing it. And thanks for being part of Doug Pagitt Radio today. We'll be back here after the break.